The checkpoint horn sounded twice, which meant they had her. Seat did not stop running. She had learned that lesson 3 border crossings ago, on the night the Vakari patrol found her mother's pack by the drainage channel, and her mother told her to run and did not follow. Seat had been running in some form ever since, and the lesson was, 2 horns means move, because 3 horns means stand still with your hands open, and that never ended the way they said it would. She ducked under the turnstile bar, the way she had seen a human child do it 3 seconds before her, and came up on the other side of the transit hall into a press of bodies and noise and smells she could not name. The station was vast, human architecture always was, built for a species that thought nothing of ceilings 30 meters high and corridors wide enough for vehicles. Seat was small even for her kind, and the crowd swallowed her completely. She pressed herself behind a luggage stack and breathed. Her ribs hurt. 2 cracked in a drainage culvert 3 weeks ago, setting badly in the dark, and they still caught on deep breaths. She breathed shallow and felt her heartbeat slow deliberately. A Rillan child in panic reads as a Rillan child to every scanner on the market, but a Rillan child standing still and breathing reads as luggage. A medic on the second cargo ship had told her that. You need to be boring, the woman had said. Seat was very good at being boring now. Her pursuers were 2 Vakari compliance officers in gray, moving fast through the gate she had just cleared. They had scanners. The scanners would read her trace signature through the crowd inside 40 seconds if she stayed still. She moved. The address was folded in her boot, the paper soft and gray from months of sweat and handling. She had memorized it so thoroughly that she could recite it half asleep, which she had done many times on the cargo floors and under berths where she had spent the last 4 months. The address was on a street called Verity Lane in a district called the Lowmarch. A human named Orphan lived there. Her mother had met him once at a transit conference 6 years ago, and he had pressed the card into her hands and said, if you are ever in trouble, this address. Not if you need it, just this address, as though trouble was always possible and the offer was permanent. Her mother had kept the card for 6 years. Seat had kept it for 4 months, through 7 transit stations and 2 nights in a drainage culvert, and 1 very long morning in the hold of a cargo lifter that smelled of engine grease and something sweet she never identified. She had kept the paper in her boot because it was the one place she was certain to remember. She did not know if Orphan still lived there, or if he would remember her mother's name. She had turned those questions over so many times they had worn smooth, like stones in a current, until they were no longer frightening, just facts she had to carry. She was going anyway. That was the whole of it. She did not know much of anything about this city except that it was human-administered, and that the Vakari had no official jurisdiction here, which meant her pursuers were operating unofficially, which meant they would be careful about open force but would not stop. The Vakari Compliance Service did not stop. That was the other lesson, and she knew it in her chest the way you know cold. She found a map panel and stared at it. The Lowmarch. She found the district label in the lower right quarter, traced the transit line in blue, counted the stops. 8 stops on the surface rail. She had no credits. A human woman stopped beside her, reading the same panel. She was maybe 50, heavy coat, a bag of groceries pressing red marks into her forearm. You look lost, the woman said, not unkindly. Seat looked up. She was aware of what she looked like. Lavender skin, silver eyes too large for her face, pointed ears under a hood that was not quite hiding them. She had been stared at on 3 worlds. She had been grabbed on 2. Lowmarch, she said. Her galactic standard was good but accented in a way that marked the Rillan tongue underneath. I need the Lowmarch. The woman studied her for a long moment. Then she pulled a paper transit slip from her coat pocket and pressed it into Seat's hand. That's a day pass. It'll get you anywhere on the network. She said it briskly, already turning back to the map. Lowmarch is 8 stops on the westbound. Verity Lane is 2 blocks south of Lowmarch Central. Seat stood very still. How did you? There's only 3 things in the Lowmarch worth visiting, the woman said. The market, the archive, and Orphan Bast's house. You don't look like you're after groceries or history. She glanced at the entrance to the transit hall, at the gray shape still pushing through the crowd. And I'd move. Seat moved. The rail car was half empty, and she sat in the furthest seat from the door, hood up, the transit slip folded in her palm. Outside, the city moved past. Stone buildings packed tight, laundry strung between upper floors, market awnings in colors she had no names for. It was a worn city, practical and dense, nothing like the open highland settlements of Rilla where she had grown up, where you could stand outside at dusk and count 4 moons without moving. She had not counted moons in 4 months. The train settled into a rhythm. She let herself feel it, the vibration through the seat, the regular percussion of the rail joints. The cracked ribs ached. She was going to think about 8 stops and Verity Lane and a door painted dark green, and she was going to keep thinking about them until they became real. Her mother had said, on the last night they were together, that Seat had a talent for stubbornness that would either save her or ruin her, and that she hoped very much it would be the former. At the 3rd stop, 2 Vakari compliance officers boarded the car. Not the same 2. These were fresh. They moved down the aisle with scanners held low, the way you hold something you want people not to notice, and Seat felt the cold certainty that they had run ahead on the network, that there were more of them, that the pursuit was more organized than she had understood. They had been waiting at stations. They had guessed she was heading into the city rather than out. The scanner swept toward her row. The man sitting across the aisle, human, broad across the shoulders, carrying a child of his own on his lap, a real human child asleep against his chest, looked at the scanner, then at Seat, then at the officers. His eyes made the same slow calculation she had seen people make before. The question behind the calculation was always, is this worth it? He shifted his sleeping child gently onto the seat beside him. Then he stood and stepped into the aisle directly in front of the nearest officer, and asked in a loud, clear voice whether the transit authority had issued permits for commercial scanning equipment in a public passenger car, because he was fairly sure they hadn't. The officers slowed. They explained, he argued. He took out a handheld and began reading regulations aloud, slowly, in the way of a man who had read regulations before and enjoyed it. And the scanner never reached Seat's row. She was off the car at the 4th stop and back on the next westbound before the argument resolved. She did not look back. At the 5th stop, a compliance officer was waiting on the platform, scanning faces at the exit. Seat sat frozen for 3 seconds that felt like a full minute. Then the woman beside her, older, small, carrying a basket of market goods, stood up and said quietly, without looking at Seat directly, "Stay close. Keep your hood down, not up." Hood say hiding. She walked off the car and Seat followed a step behind, close enough to seem like a grandchild trailing an elder the way grandchildren do, and the officer's scanner swept past both of them without pausing, because there was nothing unusual about a small child walking with an elderly woman through a transit gate. Nothing unusual at all. The older woman turned left at the top of the stairs without another word. Seat turned right. That was everything. At the 6th stop, she had to change trains. The interchange was a large open plaza under a glass roof, 3 rail lines converging, full of people and noise. She was crossing the plaza when the alert tone sounded, a city tone, the kind before an official announcement, and she looked up to see her own image on the public screen above the central board. Not her real image, a composite but close enough. The plaza crowds looked up, and Seat stood in the middle of 200 people who had all just seen her face. She did not run. Running in a crowd moving toward you is the worst thing. She had learned that too. She stood still and waited for the grab, the shout, someone's hand on her arm. A man to her left said, in a voice just loud enough, "That's a Rillin' kid." A woman to his right said, Those compliance officers have no jurisdiction on a human world. The man said, "Correct." And the crowd did not part to let the officers through. It did not surge or shout or do anything dramatic. It simply did not cooperate. People found reasons to stand in inconvenient places. A vendor's trolley became difficult to navigate around. Two elderly humans began a conversation directly in front of the fastest route through the plaza, and when an officer asked them to move, they did not understand quickly. Seat walked through the interference at a normal pace, down the steps to the westbound platform, and boarded the car. She reached the Lowmarch. Verity Lane was a narrow street of old stone, the kind repaired so many times it had become something different from what it started as, older and more itself. She walked south from the rail stop, checking numbers, and found the house at the far end where the lane bent. 2 stories. A window box with plants she could not name. A door painted dark green, the paint worn pale at the handle's edge from many years of the same hand opening it. She stood in front of it for a long time. The practical problem: she had traveled 4 months to reach a door. The door might open onto nothing useful. Orphan Bast might have moved. He might not remember her mother's name. He might be the kind of person who made offers they never expected to keep. She had no other address. She had no credits and no papers and no one in the city who knew her name, except a woman at a transit map who had known it for 30 seconds and an older woman at a platform who had never known it at all. She had run out of things to run toward, except this door. The Rillan word for courage did not mean what the human word meant. It was not the absence of fear or the mastery of it. It was closer in meaning to continuing, going forward in full knowledge that the forward is uncertain. Not a virtue, a practice. You did it or you did not. Her mother had been called courageous by the humans who knew her, and her mother had always looked faintly puzzled by the compliment, as though they were praising her for breathing. Standing at the end of 4 months of cargo holds, and cold and cracked ribs and borrowed transit passes, Seat understood the puzzlement completely. She knocked. Footsteps, a pause that felt like looking through a peephole. Then the lock turned. The man who opened the door had gray at his temples and the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades noticing things. He looked at her face, and her ears under the hood, and her hands, and whatever the look behind her told him about how she had come up the lane. "You're Cale Seat's daughter," he said. It was not a question. Her mother's name in his mouth was such a shock that she did not answer, and he went on. "She sent a message 8 weeks ago. I've been watching the transit arrivals." He opened the door fully and stepped back. "Come in, you must be cold." She was cold. She had been cold for 4 months. She crossed the threshold. The house was warm and smelled of something cooking and old paper, and the broad-leafed plants growing in every spare corner. A large gray cat regarded her from a shelf with professional skepticism. On a low table near the door, she saw a stack of printed forms, legal forms. She recognized the format from the months her mother had spent filing them before the compliance officers came, and beside the forms, a folder with her name written on the tab. Her name, in Rillan script, each character exact. He had been preparing for 8 weeks. He had been ready before she knocked. He did not make her explain herself that night. He gave her food and a room with a door that locked from the inside and said, "Tomorrow, when you're ready. There are forms to file and people to call. This will take time, but there are procedures for exactly this situation, and I have already started them." He said it as though the situation were ordinary, as though he had done this before. And she found out later that he had, twice, and that this was why her mother had kept his card. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. They had stopped shaking somewhere between the 6th and 7th stop on the westbound line, and she had not noticed until now. She thought about her mother saying run. She thought about the woman at the map panel, the man on the rail car, the woman at the 5th stop who had never looked at her directly. She thought about the crowd in the plaza that had simply declined to cooperate with something wrong, without coordinating, without asking each other. each one making the same quiet choice in the same moment. She thought about 4 months of transit floors and cargo holds and checkpoints, and about how continuing had never felt like anything heroic. It felt like putting one foot in front of the other when stopping was easier, again and again, in the dark and the cold and the not knowing, until the door at the end of it opened. The gray cat appeared in the doorway, considered her with ancient judicial authority, and then walked in and claimed the foot of the bed. Seed had not been allowed to be still in a long time. She lay back and let the stillness happen, and outside the window Verity Lane was quiet, and nobody was coming through the door.